In this lecture, we'll begin looking at the art of Greece and Rome. When looking at these two, Greece is often referred to as sort of the beginning of Western civilization. When we get into Rome, Rome is heavily influenced by Greece. Uh, so a lot of what we think today basically goes back to these two civilizations. So Greece will be looking at the geometric, the archaic, early classical, classical, late classical, and Hellenistic, and looking at what was going on during these times. So the first, looking at the geometric period. The geometric is basically after sort of the collapse of the superpowers of the area. One of the things that helped to lead to this collapse is the Persians and the other Mediterranean cultures. As I said before, they're all warring back and forth on who's dominant. And so during the geometric period, which it gets its name from, as you can see, sort of the geometric abstracted human forms. So, very different than what we normally think of for Greek art. This was, before they started to come back into power and into sort of their dominance. Everything was very geometric, simple, basic, stylized abstraction. So here we have a crater from Athens, and this would have been used as a marker for a burial or a grave. And then as we shift into the archaic period, this is when we start to get more of the city-states start to grow. So getting away from the geometric style, influenced by the Mesopotamian cultures. So they start to have a little more realistic, more natural feel to their figures. And that becomes one of the key thing for them, the emphasis on the human form, although we're not quite to where using the canons of proportions that we talked about before. So it's still sort of abstract. Not everything is as precise like we think of Greek art. So getting into the early classical, this is when if you've seen the movie 300, this is when Greece starts to conquer the Persians. One of the things that happens during this period is, all these separate little city-states start to think about, we're all in this together. If we don't start protecting each other, if we don't start to look out for each other, then, the Persians are going to come in, wipe us out. So we really need to start thinking as we are sort of one group of people, even though we still are these separate city-states. So here we have the discus thrower. One thing to point out, marble copy. The original bronze, when Rome comes and takes over Greece and they see all these bronze statues, the first thing that Romans think of is scrap metal. But since they idolized the Greeks and loved any and all things Greek, at least they did make Roman copies of the bronze before they melted them down. So the sort of unfortunate thing of learning about Greece is you look at a lot of marble copies from Rome. So the early classical Um, it's still sort of stylized, but at the same time, they're starting to push the human form, as we can see, sort of trying to understand the anatomy, showing these muscles, sort of in stress. Trying to really show that movement and the power that one would need to use and able to throw the discus. And now looking at the Parthenon in Athens. So by now we start to get the use of the golden mean, the golden ratio. Briefly talked about this before, where the numbers, the Greeks love their numbers, they love their mathematics. So when they come to this realization of the golden means, the golden ratio, they apply it not only to their sculptures and their statues, but as well as to the architecture. The architecture of the Parthenon, of this temple of Athena, as it was constructed, it was used the golden ratio to help for the measurements of it. And on the frieze sculpture that would have been up there above kind of the pediment, sort of the triangular part of the roof, it was basically when Athens defeated the Persians. So when Persia finally came in, that was one of the first things they wanted to destroy was the temple of Athena up there on the Acropolis. So starting to get into the late classical periods. So now we have the use of the canon, all of that's coming in. The S curve, the contrapposto, the more natural way that we stand. One of the other things is they start to create more emotions so that you can, feel and understand the emotions in their statues as well. And one of the other things we talked briefly about is this is getting into the in the round sculptures. Their sculptures were placed out in public so that everyone could see them. They were meant to be viewed from all sides. And some of the other things to think about uh, is these sculptures would have been clothed. They would have had the latest fashions on them. So it wasn't like the Greeks were these perverted people that just had naked statues all over the place. They would have had clothes, or if you were military, your statue would have your armor on it that you wore. If a high-ranking official, noble, the clothing and everything would reflect that, as well as there's been traces of polychrome and paint found on some of these, so they would have been painted with sort of the olive flesh tone for them. And then getting into the Hellenistic period. The Hellenistic period is basically when Alexander the Great comes down from Macedonia, takes over all of Greece, takes over Persia, spreading the Hellenistic culture along through Southwest Asia, into modern day Afghanistan and Pakistan, and sort of the northern India, and then moving back to setting up shop in Egypt. So one of the things, much more theatrical, much more emotion that they try to express. Not just the sort of mirror statue standing there looking beautiful, but you're supposed to get all this emotion and drama from the pieces as well. As you can see, sort of all the muscles tensed and flexed, trying to fight off this snake that's trying to devour. So next we'll start looking at Rome. As a Western civilization, a lot of our ideas come from Rome. And as I said before, they're kind of a stepping stone to Greece. So a lot of what Rome looks at, a lot of what Rome thinks about, comes from Greece. Some of the differences between them, while Greeks were caught up on the ideal body, the ideal appearance, Romans were a little more, as I like to say, matter of fact. As we'll look at some of the art, they have a more realistic portrayal. So the periods that we'll look at, the Republican periods before the emperor came, Rome felt that in order to survive, they should be a republic. They should be ruled by the people. What made them better is not to have a king. One person should not have all the power. That's what led to the downfall of all the other civilizations. All the other civilizations they conquered, they were too worried about their kings and the nobility and the ruling. So if we have no king, then our culture can last much longer. Of course, that doesn't last long, so we get into the early empire and into the late empire periods. So starting off in the Republican period, Rome, founded in 510 BCE, the city of Rome, starting out as a small city-state, and of course growing larger from there. Their neighbors to the north, the Etruscans, who were fascinated with death, Rome was more than happy to let them embrace their love of death. And while the generals that Alexander the Great left in charge of his empire, while they were fighting with each other, they failed to notice that here came Rome coming down to defeat them, and of course, expanding the Roman land ownings even more because of that. So here we have a head of a Roman from the Republican period, and as you can see, unlike the Greeks, where whatever stage of life you're at as a citizen of Greece, you would want to be portrayed at sort of your prime, when you looked your best. Where here, the Roman, more mature-looking gentleman, uh, wants to be portrayed for who he actually is. And so looking at the architecture, very similar to the architecture of Greece before they start using the arch. Some of the differences between Roman and Greek architecture. Where I was talking about the Temple of Athena up there on the pediment, the little triangular area just under the roof. Romans would leave that blank. The Greeks would fill that with some type of relief sculpture, as well as along the tablature, the part that is right above the columns. Greeks would often have other relief sculptures all along the buildings. Romans left it blank. They might have some more sort of decorative type stones cut and placed up there. About the only thing that you might find up there would be, in this case, the Temple of Fortuna, uh, built by the Jones family. Whatever family, they might add their name to it if they wanted to, or it just might have Temple of Fortuna. And then the columns, Romans often would carve their columns in one single piece, whereas the Greeks would have segmented columns. When we briefly talked about the Greek order, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthians, well, you can date Greek temples by the use of that. Romans used them as more of a classification system. Depending what social standing the neighborhood is, it sort of that was where the columns would go. So in the working class, you would have the Ionic columns. Doric columns would be in the merchant class, and the Corinthians were just for the noble class. So the paintings, Romans were known for their paintings. There's actually 4 different styles of Roman paintings, majority of them frescoes. And the unfortunate events of Pompeii and Herculaneum is what we've learned a great deal of Rome life about, from. These 2 unfortunate victims of the destruction, from Mount Vesuvius of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Essentially they froze these 2 towns, and well preserved. So a lot of what we know and understand comes from these 2 cities.